You know that feeling, right? You're in a meeting or on a big project, and it just feels stuck. There are way too many people, and you're making zero progress. It's a super common frustration, and it turns out there's a really deep paradox behind it. So let's dig into why adding more people to the mix can sometimes feel like you're actually going backwards. Our story starts, of all places, with a simple rope. Back in the 1880s, a French engineer, Maximilien Ringelmann, got really curious about human effort. So he set up an experiment. He had people pull on a rope, first by themselves and then in bigger and bigger groups. And what he found was pretty wild. When people pulled alone, they gave it their all, 100%. But in a group of 8, each person was only pulling at about half their individual strength. He called this the Ringelmann effect. The bigger the team gets, the less hard each person actually works.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. It turns out there are 2 culprits causing this drop-off. First, you've got motivation loss. When you're in a big group, it's easy to feel like your own effort doesn't really matter, so you think, someone else will pick up the slack. And then there's coordination loss. Just trying to get everyone to pull the rope at the exact same time is a logistical nightmare.
So, case closed, right? Big groups are just a bad idea? Well, not so fast. Because the story gets a whole lot more complicated thanks to a few other brilliant thinkers who saw things in a completely different light.
Let's jump ahead a few decades to a livestock fair in England. A guy named Francis Galton, who, by the way, was pretty skeptical about the intelligence of the average person, had an idea. He saw about 800 people trying to guess the weight of an ox, and he decided to use their guesses to prove how dumb crowds are.
Well, the joke was on him. He proved the exact opposite. The crowd's median guess was 1,207 pounds. The ox's actual weight, 1,198 pounds. The crowd's guess was off by less than 1%. It was a stunning demonstration of the wisdom of the crowd.
Fast forward again, and another idea pops up that champions large groups. But this time, it's all about the power of connections. Robert Metcalfe suggested that the value of a network doesn't just grow, it grows exponentially with every new person who joins.
And this visual just shows it perfectly, right? 2 people, you've got 1 connection. But add a third, and suddenly you have 3 connections. By the time you get to 10 people, you have a whopping 45 connections. Every single person you add makes the network dramatically more valuable for everyone else.
But, and this is a big but, that same explosion of connections that creates so much value, it also has a really dark side. And this is where a computer scientist named Fred Brooks comes into the story. Brooks, drawing from his experience managing massive projects at IBM, dropped this legendary quote. His point was that every one of those valuable new connections also adds communication overhead. It's a hidden tax on the project's time. And you can see that pain right here. At first, adding more people helps speed things up, but then you hit a tipping point. The sheer cost of keeping everyone in the loop becomes so overwhelming that the project actually starts to slow down. The team ends up spending more time in meetings talking about the work than actually doing the work. So, what's the deal? Are big groups a curse? Just doomed by slacking and communication chaos? Or are they a blessing, full of collective genius and incredible network value? Well, the answer is kind of both. The real challenge is figuring out how to get all the good stuff without all the bad. And that brings us to the modern solution, this really cool idea that lets organizations have their cake and eat it too. It's a philosophy that says you don't have to pick between being big and being fast. You see, some of the most forward-thinking companies out there have basically cracked the code. They figured out that the secret isn't to stop growing, it's to be incredibly smart and deliberate about how you're structured. They figured out how to get big by acting small. So, how in the world did they pull this off? Well, it boils down to a playbook with 5 core principles that completely flip this paradox on its head. Let's break them down, one by one. Okay, so here are the 5 keys. Having a powerful purpose, keeping your team small, organizing as a network, embracing radical transparency, and finally, fostering real peer accountability. When you put them all together, you create a system that can scale beautifully. All right, first up, purpose. Remember Ringelmann's slacking problem? That motivation loss? Well, a powerful mission is the antidote. When people believe in what they're doing and can see how their specific work fits into the bigger picture, they don't want to hide. They want to contribute. It makes the work personal. Second, you've got to keep teams small. Think of the famous 2-pizza rule. If you can't feed the team with 2 pizzas, it's too big. When you give these small, autonomous teams total ownership of a project from start to finish, you solve two massive problems at once. An individual's effort is completely visible, so there's no hiding, and coordination is actually manageable, which means you avoid that communication nightmare Fred Brooks warned us about.
And here's the magic trick. You get all the upside of Metcalfe's law because every new team you add creates more value for the whole network, but you contain the downside of Brooks's law inside each of those small, manageable teams. It's truly the best of both worlds.
So how does this actually look? Well, instead of that classic corporate pyramid, the organization starts to look like a network of teams. You grow by adding more teams, not by adding more layers of middle management. The intense day-to-day communication stays inside the teams, while communication between the teams stays pretty light and efficient.
Number 4, transparency is completely non-negotiable. When you don't have managers acting as information gatekeepers, that info has to flow freely to everyone. Sharing everything, performance data, company goals, even financials, lets that collective intelligence that Galton discovered really thrive. And of course, when everyone can see what's going on, it's really hard to hide, which is a direct shot at the Ringelmann effect.
And finally, peer accountability is the glue that holds this whole system together. This is where colleagues hold each other to a high standard without needing a boss to step in. Now look, this is probably the hardest part to get right, but when it works, your reputation inside the company becomes a kind of currency, and that creates a level of discipline that's often way stronger than any top-down command.
So when you boil it all down, what's the big takeaway here? It's that these powerful forces, these things discovered by Ringelmann and Galton over a century ago, they're not just dusty old ideas from a textbook. They are active principles that are shaping our teams and our companies every single day.
And that brings us to the most important question, which this quote just nails perfectly. The question isn't whether these forces exist in your workplace. They do. The real question is, which one is your company's structure built to amplify? That choice isn't an accident. It's a direct result of deliberate design. So you have to ask yourself, which one is your workplace amplifying?